Order! Order! You are an incorrigible delinquent at times. Behave yourself, man!
The Home Secretary has apologised for what she's called the wrong and appalling treatment of some Windrush generation immigrants. Some of those who've arrived here from the Caribbean with their parents from 1948 onwards are now losing their jobs, losing their benefits and face deportation as part of a government review of their immigration status. That's despite having lived here most of their lives. In a dramatic U-turn, Amber Rudd has announced a new task force with what she calls a completely new approach. She's also admitted she doesn't know if anyone's already been deported in error. Our Community Affairs correspondent, Adina Campbell, reports.
London is the place for me.
They were invited by the government to rebuild post-war Britain 70 years ago and marked the beginning of Commonwealth immigration.
France or America.
But now the children of the Windrush generation, children like painter and decorator Anthony Bryan, who came to the UK from Jamaica when he was 8, have been detained and nearly deported for not having paperwork to prove their right to remain in the UK. He was held in a detention centre twice for nearly 3 weeks last year.
It was a shock because I've always thought that I was legal. I was British. I've been here from my mate. I thought I didn't give it another thought. Because I just think they was mixing me up. Anyway, unfortunately, they weren't mixing me up. It wasn't me they were after, and it was me they were locking up.
The Empire Windrush brings...
An increasing number of people in this group have been experiencing problems under recent changes to immigration laws. But the Home Office did not keep a record of those legally entitled to live in the UK before 1973, meaning some are finding it difficult to prove their status. After weeks of intensifying pressure to intervene, the government has now apologised and set up a dedicated team. But an urgent question by Labour MP David Lammy in the Commons earlier revealed his outrage at the way people have been treated.
Can she tell the House how many have been detained as prisoners in their own country? Can she tell the House how many have been denied health under the National Health Service? How many have denied pensions? How many have lost their job? This is a day of national shame, and it has come about because of a hostile environment policy that was begun under her Prime Minister.
Home Secretary Amber Rudd announced the government is now taking action.
I am concerned that the Home Office has become too concerned with policy and strategy and sometimes lose sight of the individual. And this is about individuals.
And her response to this problem now is far too passive, just a task force that relies on the Windrush generation raising their problems with her. That's not good enough.
Both sides of this House need to accept the need for a proper debate about immigration, an open and honest debate about immigration, and if we did that, we might come to the proper conclusion that it's not just the Windrush generation, but it's generations over centuries of immigrants that have contributed in a positive way to all aspects of life in our country.
The Prime Minister Theresa May has also confirmed she will hold a discussion with Commonwealth leaders tomorrow.
But I'd like to see them start treating our Jamaican citizens like they are somebody and not nobody. That's all. I'm not asking for much, you know, and just because we deserve it. We've worked, we've built up this country, you know, and we'd like to see it build us up as well. You know, like, you know what I mean? It works both ways.
Anthony Bryan is still waiting for legal paperwork to confirm his right to stay in the UK. Adina Campbell, BBC News.
Well, let's talk to our Deputy Political Editor, John Pienaar, who's at the Home Office for us. So, John, the government's been under pressure on this issue for weeks. Why did the Home Secretary suddenly give way now?
Fiona, whichever way you look at it, the Home Office fouled up and fouled up badly when a government's taking hits on one side from Jeremy Corbyn and on the other from a right-wing Conservative like Jacob Rees-Mogg, when a liberal-leaning left-wing paper like The Guardian is attacking the government in almost identical terms as a right-leaning tabloid like The Sun. A minister would have to be very obtuse not to realise they're in a very bad place. The last-minute agreement to meet Caribbean leaders with a Commonwealth Summit taking place right here in London this week, that looked flat-footed, and Amber Rudd didn't sound 100% certain that no one had been deported wrongly. So this retreat did look inevitable, but it was extraordinary, even so, to hear Amber Rudd apologising in the way that she did, saying her department's conduct hadn't just been wrong, it was appalling.
So what has the Home Office been doing to get it so badly wrong?
Well, Amber Rudd admitted, or as good as admitted today, that her department had earned a reputation for being not just strict in applying immigration rules, but harsh. Critics are tracing what they're describing as an immigration hostile environment back to the time of Theresa May. So they'll be watching very closely now as this department tries to balance a more compassionate, sensitive way of dealing with immigration against a continuing need to bear down on immigration. This department's under a great deal of pressure. Brexit's coming, apart from anything else, and they'll be watched very, very closely as they deal with people in this country, individuals and families, many of whom have been here for many years.
John Peanut at the Home Office, thank you.
The Immigration Minister made the startling admission today that Commonwealth migrants may have been wrongly deported by the Home Office. Caroline Noakes tells ITV News she knew of horrendous cases, but couldn't say how many have been removed, despite having had the legal right to stay. Around 500,000 people came to the UK in the 1950s and 60s to work in essential services. But many of the so-called Windrush generation were never formally registered. Tonight, the Home Secretary Amber Rudd apologised and insisted there would be no more removals or detentions. Labour branded it a disgrace. Our Social Affairs editor Penny Marshall has more.
On board, on their way to Britain, the first wave of West Indians...
They came for a better life, but now thousands of the children of those very first Commonwealth settlers have been made to feel very unwelcome. The so-called Windrush babies are now in their 50s, and after a lifetime of work, many face uncertainty because they don't have the right papers. Today, government ministers said tough new rules had already hurt some.
Have people been deported as a result of not having the right papers?
There have been some horrendous situations which, as a minister, have appalled me.
So what I'm
determined to do...
That's a yes. Do you know how many?
No, I don't know the numbers. But what I'm determined to do going forward is to say we'll have no more of this. We want people to have confidence to come to the Home Office.
But people like Glenda Caesar are losing confidence by the day.
We will go back to our own HMRC and DWP records.
She's been here since she was 3 months old and has worked in the NHS for 25 years, but now can't work. She hasn't yet got the paperwork to satisfy the Home Office.
Why am I not British? I've got children, I went to school here, I've got a national insurance number, I had a provisional licence, so why am I not British?
Anyone who came to the UK from a Commonwealth country before 1973 was legally entitled to live here. But there are incomplete records of who arrived, and it's thought around 57,000 people haven't applied for passports to prove their residency. It means many don't have the necessary documents to work, rent property or access benefits.
We cannot have 60-something, 70-year-old persons who have made invaluable contributions to this country to be living in fear. Some of them are afraid that the next knock they hear on the door will be the authorities picking them up and bringing them to a detention centre. That needs to stop.
Many heads of state are in the UK this week for a Commonwealth summit. The Prime Minister has promised to meet them about this, and they want action. Meanwhile, political pressures mounting.
This is a day of national shame, and it has come about because of a hostile environment policy that was begun under her Prime Minister.
Frankly, some of the way they have been treated has been wrong, has been appalling, and I am sorry.
It's not clear how many of the thousands who were invited here to work in the 60s and 70s are now affected. But tonight, the government's under pressure to reassure many who came here legally half a century ago that they have the right to live and work here now. Penny Marshall, ITV News.
Our political correspondent Carl Dinnan is outside the Home Office tonight. So, Carl, this is proving to be a huge embarrassment, isn't it, for the government?
Huge and completely self-inflicted. At first, Number 10 indicated the Prime Minister wouldn't meet anyone from the Commonwealth on this before they said, oh, OK, yes, she will. Then the Immigration Minister told Penny that she thought some people may have been deported. Before the Home Secretary, her boss, stood up in the Commons and said actually she didn't know about any deportations, but if anyone else did, would they please get in touch? And then to cap it all, the Home Secretary, Amber Rudd, said the Home Office was sometimes too concerned with policy and strategy and lost sight of individuals. And that's an incredible criticism coming from the woman who has run this department for 2 years, a department which for 6 years before that was run by Theresa May herself. Now, they have set up a task force to deal with this problem here now, but it has been a bad day at the Home Office.
OK, Carl Dinnan at the Home Office, thank you.
Tonight, the government has finally admitted that the way it has treated people who came to the United Kingdom from the Caribbean as children before 1973 was a mistake and has apologised. There were angry exchanges in Parliament as the Home Secretary Amber Rudd admitted that immigration policy had been put before the treatment of people. Our senior Home Affairs correspondent Simon Israel has this report.
They came at the invitation of the British government. They were citizens of British colonies or newly independent Commonwealth countries. Their passports were stamped indefinite leave to remain. But for some who were children then, that was a false promise. Tony Bryan, on the right, came with his brothers when he was 7. 5 decades later, he found himself in an immigration detention centre twice, with a seat booked on a flight to Jamaica. Until today, there had been no Home Office apology.
I do not want any of the Commonwealth citizens who are here legally to be impacted in the way they have. And frankly, some of the way they have been treated has been wrong, has been appalling, and I am sorry.
Today, more than 140 MPs from all parties signed a letter to Theresa May calling on her to find a swift resolution to this growing crisis. In it, they say,
the impact has been felt in cases of individuals losing the right to work, to rent property, to receive pensions, to access their bank accounts, or even access vital healthcare. A particularly cruel twist of fate, as so many of those affected have spent their lives in the service of our National Health Service.
This is a day of national shame, and it has come about because of a hostile environment policy that was begun under her Prime Minister. Let us call it as it is. If you lay down with dogs, you get fleas. And that is what has happened with this far-right rhetoric in this country. Can she apologise properly?
I am concerned that the Home Office has become too concerned with policy and strategy and sometimes lose sight of the individual. And this is about individuals.
5 years ago, these vans were on the streets of London as part of a much tougher immigration policy on individuals. It symbolised Theresa May's pledge to create a really hostile environment for illegal immigrants. But Caribbean High Commissioners have said they complained 2 years ago about the treatment of those belonging to the Windrush generations. Nothing happened, they said. Does this issue, does treating law-abiding Caribbean people as illegal immigrants when they're not, does this issue draw a line in the sand as far as the hostile environment goes?
It really has. For many, many years, we've heard the government say that it wants to bring immigration down to a certain number of people, whatever the cost. Well, this is the cost. When you introduce immigration checks into everyday life, when you ask people to spy on their neighbours, their employees, their tenants, their patients, this is what happens. And groups like ours have been warning about this since the introduction of the hostile environment.
The High Commissioners have tales of those who return to the West Indies for family funerals not being allowed back. But the Home Secretary said she wasn't aware of any such cases, even though her department said today some may have been deported in error.
Well, earlier I spoke to the Immigration Minister, Caroline Noakes, and started by asking her what reassurances the government could give to people who arrived before 1973 that they wouldn't be deported.
I think this is absolutely the crux of the matter. I'm very conscious that there are many people who came here prior to January 73 who have every right to be here, but just lack the necessary documentation to prove it. So my message to them is make contact with the Home Office. We are determined to help.
Well, let's be a bit more specific about what help you can offer, because there's now a petition, as I'm sure you've seen, which has gathered well over 100,000 signatures and counting, which urges you to lower the documentary proof required. Can you commit to doing that as a matter of urgency?
Oh, we've absolutely committed to lowering the documentary proof. I'm very conscious that there may well be people who haven't had many interactions with authority over the course of their lives. They've just got on with living here, working here and enjoying their time in the UK.
So they don't need to produce a passport?
They absolutely don't need to produce a passport. What is imperative to me is that they make contact with the Home Office, and we will help them build up a picture of their time in the UK. We're going to work with HMRC and with DWP to establish any records that might exist that way.
And they won't be charged for that?
They won't be charged for that. What's really important is that we recognise that people have the right to make a no time limits application, which will establish their right to a biometric residence permit. And I'm very conscious that people who came here in the 50s, 60s, very early 70s have contributed an enormous amount to our society, to our communities. And my message to them is please make contact, because we want to help.
I mean, there are some heartbreaking stories of what's happened to people as a result of what your government has been doing. I just want to put some of them to you. I mean, Anthony Bryan told us he was detained twice in an immigration removal centre. Michael Braithwaite told us that he was deemed illegal after reapplying for a job in a school, and he suffered a mental breakdown as a consequence. Albert Thompson is waiting for prostate cancer treatment. He was informed that he'd have to pay for the treatment because he couldn't prove that he was legally in the UK. Do you apologise to each and every one of them for the distress caused?
I absolutely recognise the stories that we've all heard have been heartbreaking and wrong.
You apologise to them?
And I'm absolutely determined that we're going to put them right and make sure that people who may have come here on their parents' passports as children have absolutely a deemed right to be here. And we're determined to give them the status that they need and that we want them to have.
Do you not apologise to them, though? I mean, do you not feel personally moved by what you've heard?
Of course I feel personally moved. I'm very sorry that this has come about, but I think my main priority has to be to put it right.
Well, that's a tragedy, isn't it? That a lot of these people were invited here by the government to come and work in the NHS, and then their children can't get the free NHS healthcare. That is a tragedy, isn't it?
It's absolutely wrong that people who have come here and contributed, who we invited, should be caught up in a situation where their status can't be demonstrated. So that's why we want them to get in contact with us so that we can help them get their biometric residence permits, so that we can establish their rights, because it's really important that we can draw a distinction between this group of people who we absolutely welcome and want to be here and those who are here illegally.
But you really have no idea whether the estimate of 50,000 people affected is an underestimate or about right?
I think it's impossible to speculate when we know that many people will have travelled here on their parents' passports, and pre-1973 we didn't have digital records, so it's very hard for us to know.
How many people, I'm sure you do have these records, who came here pre-1973 from the Commonwealth have been deported, say, to the Caribbean?
What I know is that individual cases are heartbreaking, and it's really important to me that going forward we get this right.
But people have been deported to the Caribbean in error, potentially?
Potentially they have been, and I'm very conscious that it's very much in error, and that's an error I want to put right.
And presumably invite those people back as soon as possible?
Well, absolutely. These are people who we welcomed here way back in the 50s and 60s, and it's really important to me that we correct any error and that we send a message of reassurance to people who are here. We want to get this right for them.
Caroline Noakes, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Well, I'm joined now by St Kitts and Nevis Foreign Minister Mark Brantley and by Anthony Bryan, who faced removal to Jamaica even though he'd lived and worked in the UK for more than 50 years. Minister, first, the UK government invited Caribbean residents to come and help rebuild British society. And this now is how they're repaid. What's your reaction to that?
It's very important to say Caribbean residents, but it's also very important to point out that these were all British subjects at the time, these were people coming from what were British colonies in the Caribbean. Jamaica was the first country to become independent. That was not until 1962. But the Windrush, and this so-called Windrush generation that we've been referring to, would have come in 1948. So you're absolutely correct that people were invited to come to help to rebuild this country after World War II. We're told from the records that some 550,000 people, which at the time represented almost 15% of the population in the Caribbean, came here.
And this is now how they're repaid. I mean, what's your reaction to that?
Well, we are quite put out by it, and I see some who are clearly badly affected. I think whilst the numbers are not quite known, estimates put it at about 50,000 people that have been affected. And the problem is that a lot of these people don't know. It's only when they change jobs or apply for some benefit, or in some circumstances when they've traveled outside the country and tried to gain re-entry, are they then hit with the fact that their status is irregular.
Well, let me bring in Anthony Bryan here, because, I mean, you were twice sent to an immigration detention centre, weren't you? And you actually booked on a flight back to Jamaica. What toll has all of this taken on you?
All I can say, it's stressful, very stressful, you know. And then when they brought me and locked me up in the Verne, and I know I didn't do nothing, it's hard to keep your mind. It'd have been easier if I'd done something.
And you didn't keep your job, did you?
No, I had to give up my job because they told me that I can't work without that status.
So does this public apology that you've heard from the Home Secretary and the Minister, the Immigration Minister today, does that help in any way?
Well, it helps in a sense to know that they knew that they'd done wrong, and they acknowledge that they've done wrong and trying to make amends of it. For that reason, yeah. But for me personally, it's going to take a good long while for me to get over what I'm going through at the moment.
And you've now got the biometric card that proves your British citizenship.
Well, funny enough, as I was coming into the studio, I met the guy who said that, why haven't I come and pick up my pass yet? Because he's got it there waiting for me.
Good.
I mean, Minister, do you know of anyone who arrived here before 1973 from Commonwealth countries who has been wrongly removed?
Well, I don't know of anyone personally, but certainly the briefing that I've received since I've been here in London for the Commonwealth Heads of Government meeting from our High Commissioners suggests that there are such people. And I believe that the statements that we've heard today from your Home Secretary in Parliament, and indeed at a meeting that we just had with your Minister with responsibility for immigration, suggests that there might be such individuals who were unlawfully deported, improperly deported. And what we have now sought to discuss is there a mechanism that can be put in place to provide some redress for those individuals. But for the grace of God, this gentleman right here might well have been deported. And we have to recognize that these were people who would have come here at the ages of 3 and 4, sometimes younger. Many have came on their parents' passports, and it has been very difficult for them. He says he came on his parents' passport, so it's very difficult for them to prove what is being asked of them. So we welcome very much the apology that we have heard. We welcome very much the commitment that has been made today by your Home Secretary in the Parliament. And what we're now asking from the Caribbean region is to see how we can have this commitment, the process, so that this commitment can be actualized, so that people can get the relief that they deserve.
You mentioned redress. I mean, Anthony, are you looking for compensation, given that you've had to spend, I think, several thousands on legal fees?
Well, to be honest, I'm only looking for why I'm in debt. So if they can clear my debt and put me back where I was, that'd be fine with me. I'm not looking for nothing, no special treatment.
And I mean, people are saying that the Home Secretary should resign because this is has been such a screw-up. How do you view that?
On she resigning, I wouldn't like to be the one to say she must resign, because I'm not feeling that way at the moment.
Mark,
I think the reality is that for individuals such as our friend here, who came from Jamaica originally, they have paid their taxes, they've been contributors here, they came at a time when Britain needed us, and we came to help to rebuild. I think the harsh and sad realities, many have now lost bank accounts, lost access to jobs, many have been subject to detention or deportation. So I was particularly pleased today to hear the Home Secretary say that she is causing for cessation of all deportations and detentions. But there may be people even now, as we speak, who are still in detention. So we've also asked for some rapidity of movement to ensure that those people are not detained for any longer. So the truth is we see some light at the end of this tunnel. It is our hope that we can get this resolved and that people who are properly British nationals will be recognized as such.
And Anthony, when you were in the detention removal centre, did you come across people who were about to be deported? Do you believe that people have been deported who came to this country before 73?
I know people have been deported. I had a friend in there. His mum's 80 years old. He was looking after his mum. He's 61 years old. They sent him back to Jamaica.
And he was here in the UK before 73?
He was in Oxford when I was in Oxford.
Just very briefly, Minister, what damage has this done to the relationship between the Commonwealth and Britain?
Well, we're hopeful that, like many other issues that arise within families, and the Commonwealth is a family, that these are issues that can be resolved. I think it's not a good day for relations in that sense, but I'm hopeful that with the type of action that we're seeing now from the statements from the Home Secretary, the commitments that are being given, that this will be treated with the utmost priority. And if it's done, I feel that what damage that has been done can be repaired if our people are simply acknowledged and given their proper and rightful place within the UK society.
Mark Brantley, Anthony Bryan, thank you both so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
Recent treatment of many of those from the Windrush generation has, by any standards, been cruel and humiliating. But in angry scenes in Parliament today, some critics suggested the policies only in keeping with the government's self-proclaimed hostile environment on immigration. Amongst them was the Tottenham MP David Lammy, who nodded to the language of the far right he believed had made its way into government thinking, before calling on the Prime Minister to recognise the company she was keeping and the effect it was having on her policies. The Home Secretary came to the House to apologise after testament after testament had been heard from those who came to Britain decades ago at the invitation of the British government, only now to be treated like foreigners, imposters in their own home. Here's our political editor, Nick Watt.
I felt like an alien. What's that word they use for people who are on the run? A fugitive. I felt that the tap on the shoulder would be somebody saying to me, you don't belong here, you need to be put away or whatever. I don't know why they did it. They must know why they did what they did, to cause people harm and total upheaval.
The Empire Windrush brings to Michael Braithwaite came here as a 9-year-old boy, as a proud member of the Windrush generation. He went to school here and has worked and paid taxes here all his life. He is British. But when the school he worked at looked to renew some paperwork, questions were asked that he couldn't answer. Official letters were dispatched, and suddenly he was being treated as an outsider in his own country. The legal status of the Windrush generation has come to the fore on the eve of the Commonwealth Heads of Government meeting, after Downing Street initially declined to meet Caribbean leaders to discuss their plight. Theresa May hastily reversed that decision, but this did little to quell the anger.
The government, the political class, some in my own party, have played a dog whistle on immigration that has led us to this point. And that's why I said, if you lay down with dogs, you get fleas. This was a rhetoric that when I was growing up was largely confined to the extreme of one political party or indeed to the BNP. It's now a discourse writ large, and this is the natural consequence.
The Home Secretary offered a heartfelt apology for what she described as the appalling treatment of those involved. And then this.
I am concerned that the Home Office has become too concerned with policy and strategy and sometimes lose sight of the individual. And this is about individuals. And we have seen the individual stories. And they have been, some of them, terrible to hear. And that is why I have acted. That is why I have put a very clear time limit on the amount of time it will take to correct this. That is why I am so committed to ensuring that there is no cost involved.
The decision by Amber Rudd to raise questions about her own department over an issue relating to Theresa May's time in the job shows the cold fury amongst some ministers
over the treatment of the Windrush generation. These ministers hope that by showing sensitivity to those caught up in bureaucracy, they will be able to take the heat out of this most sensitive of issues. But one senior Tory who sat in government with Theresa May when she pledged to create a hostile environment for illegal migrants told me the Home Office tightened things up, and this is where you end up. The Windrush generation were granted settled status if they'd arrived in the UK before 1973. Official papers appeared not to matter until 1996, when employers were required to check the immigration record of employees. This was lightly enforced. A decade later, Labour did enforce these rules with large fines, but checks were not widespread. In 2012, Theresa May announced a hostile environment for illegal migrants. Landlords and providers of public services had to check papers.
Before we start lambasting ministers for responding to what has clearly been high levels of public disquiet, we have to take that into account. Officials should look sensibly at the story which a person gives them. And if it's clearly obvious that they've been in this country for many years and probably come in as children at the time of the Empire Windrush first coming here, that should immediately ring alarm bells that in fact they're dealing with somebody who firstly would be able to regularise their position in this country without any difficulty and would be entitled to a British passport as a consequence, and that secondly they should be very careful about not acting towards them in a way which undermines their undoubted rights.
We landed, and that's the first time I've had the feeling of cold air on my legs. It was quite weird.
For Michael Braithwaite and his family, there's a happy ending. He's days away from securing the necessary paperwork. For many, the heartache continues.
That was Nick Watt. Well, we did ask the government to join us on the programme tonight. There wasn't anyone available. In a statement, the Home Office said its new task force would work across government to help individuals identify and gather evidence to prove their rights to remain in Britain. Well, I'm joined now by Sonia Williams. She came to Britain from Barbados in 1975, aged 13, but started having problems in 2014 when she was told she didn't have indefinite leave to remain. She has since had her driving licence withdrawn. Also with us, Trevor Phillips, the former chair of the Equalities and Human Rights Commission. His family is originally from Guyana. And the Tory MP, Chris Phelp, joins us from Westminster. Nice to have you all. And Sonia, if I can start with you. For 4 years now, you've been fighting to prove that this is your home and you're British.
Yeah, I can't drive, I can't work, I can't claim benefits, I can't do anything.
They took away your licence and you think your job as well?
Yeah.
What happened?
They came to me early 2014 and just asked for ID. They needed to update their records. I was there for 8 years. And later the year, about 6 months later, they said, we don't need you anymore, we're making you redundant. I still didn't think nothing of it until when they took away my driving licence in 2016, I started to put it together and I thought, no, this is all connected. And they're saying I'm an illegal immigrant.
So you came technically in 75, which was just after the cut-off.
Yes.
And do you think that was why they were acting like this, or do you think...
Well, I didn't know anything about any cut-off. I didn't know, so...
And you had the paperwork?
Well, I don't know. I came here as a minor to join my mum, dad, my sister and my brother. They were born here. My mum's got citizen. My dad had right to remain. So I just presume I had all that because I was leaving Barbados to come and live with my family. I wasn't just coming on a holiday.
You heard the Home Secretary, we just played on that film, Amber Rudd, saying she apologised. She thought maybe policy had got in the way of people. What's your response tonight?
I don't really accept her apology because they've been giving me the runaround and no one's telling me where to go or what to do. Everyone's just talking about these great big monies that I haven't got because I'm not working, I can't claim benefits, so where am I going to get this money to apply for these things they're asking me for?
What do you think the damage has been done to you personally?
Well, I don't know, numb. Sometimes I just want to give up, crying, stressed.
Tonight, the Home Office has been in touch with us. We've explained your case to them, and they've said that they will be in touch with you tomorrow. Your reaction to that?
Well, I sent you all the necessary paperwork, and you wrote me back and told me I don't have the right. And now, all of a sudden, tonight, I've got the right for them to give me a phone call.
Let me just read this out in case we can't see it. This is to Mrs. Sonia Yvette Williams. Your no time limit biometric permit application has been withdrawn as you never held indefinite leave to remain.
How did they come to that conclusion?
Let's ask Chris Phelps. Can you tell Sonia and others like her how the government is prepared to compensate her for what she's been through?
Well, look, the experience that Sonia has had and others like her is completely unacceptable, as Amber Rudd, the Home Secretary, said in the House today. As the child of Windrush generation arrivals in the UK, I think she should have the right to remain. And the announcement today means that she can have, and others in her position, can have a fast-track indefinite leave to remain and associated paperwork.
Hang on a second, Chris Phelps. You're talking about she should have the right to remain. You've just heard from a woman who's had her job taken away from her and her driving licence. The very least she gets is the right to remain. What about the compensation?
Well, that wasn't discussed in the Commons today.
Should it be?
I think that's something that could be looked at, but the most important thing is to get these cases fixed really quickly. I had a case very similar to Sonia's, a lady called Emily who came here in the 1960s, and the problem is that proving the process that existed until today to prove that somebody in these circumstances is allowed to stay here and receive benefits and all the rest of it was unbelievably bureaucratic. And even as an MP,
right.
I was
helping... So whose fault was that? Whose fault was it if the government made it so bureaucratic that people couldn't prove their status?
Well, the system was too bureaucratic, and as Amber Rudd said in the Commons today, policy got in the way of the individual case.
Right. So what about, just a second, what about those who were deported? Because we still don't know how many people have actually been sent back to places that they barely even knew as babies.
Yeah. Well, as far as Amber Rudd in the Commons today said that she wasn't aware of any cases of actual deportations. Looking at the sort of media coverage and doing quite extensive research, I've seen 2 cases where it was contemplated, but it didn't actually happen. So as far as I'm aware, no deportation cases actually took place.
Right, so because you've looked at 2 cases that didn't happen, you're assuming that there wasn't deportation, or what?
Hang on, and the Home Secretary has said that she's not aware of any either. But frankly, it shouldn't even have got to the stage where people were facing the threat of deportation, because, as your piece said, often people have been here for 30, 40, 50 years.
It shouldn't have got to that, because...
No, it shouldn't.
Not least because, as you well know, Commonwealth leaders and High Commissioners told you this was happening 2 years ago. Why was it ignored?
Well, again, looking at the timeline, I think it was really sort of strongly escalated 2 or 3 months ago. Clearly, the process hasn't been...
When the Mail covered it, when the Daily Mail covered it, rather than High Commissioners making that point, and the Guardian newspaper, but you respond to the Mail now, right?
Well, look, I think we respond to parliamentary debate, as we did today. But look, I think everyone has acknowledged the system wasn't working properly. Sonia's case makes that point very clear. I've seen it in a single piece of constituency casework as well. The system wasn't working. As an MP, I am sorry for that. I'm sorry for the experience that Sonia had and other people have had. They shouldn't have lost jobs or had difficulty getting driving licence. It was wrong.
Let me put this to...
hang on, let me finish. And it has been fixed today. The time limit we're looking at is 2 weeks. There'll be no charge for it at all. So it wasn't working properly.
I want to go to Trevor Phillips.
It should be.
Chris, thank you very much indeed. You were formerly head of the Commission for Racial Equality. Trevor Phillips, what do you think went wrong here?
I think what went wrong, what is still going wrong, is every bit of this gets more disreputable by the second. No minister will come on. They put on poor old Chris Phelps to defend the indefensible. The Prime Minister talks about burning injustices. This one should be burning a hole through her conscience. Because what we've now got is a situation where, actually, if you get to go on Newsnight, then suddenly the Home Office calls you up. There are 50,000 people. They can't all get on Newsnight. And what has happened here is that actually the government was warned about this in 2014 by the Runnymede Trust and others, that this was what was going to happen. They ignored it because small group of people, Caribbean people, were laid back. We won't make a fuss. We don't have to be paid attention to.
Do you think that was old-fashioned racism at play? Was that...
I don't want to get into accusations of racism, because that then will take the focus away from what happened here. The government, Whitehall, thought that this was a group of people who really didn't matter. They don't vote for this government particularly. They are not significant, so we didn't need to pay attention to them. There are two pieces of legislation that the Home Office should have paid attention to. First of all, they've got a duty, I know this because I wrote the legislation, to pay attention to the diverse effects of legislation on different groups. They didn't pay any attention to the effect on this particular group. And by the way, the Human Rights Act says you should not be able to apply legislation retrospectively. And this is what the 2014 Act did.
What would you now be advising Sonia and the thousands like her to do?
I don't think it's up to Sonia and the thousands like them to do anything except to say, you've got to fix it. Because, by the way, I myself, had I not been lucky enough to be an accidental 10th child in my family, if I'd been born where my family came from in Guyana, I would be in exactly the same position. I wouldn't have the documentation. It's not for us to fix it, it's for the government to fix this. And what they could do is, first of all, move the burden of proof on authorities, the driving authorities, health service and so on, to the authorities rather than to the individual person like Sonia. And then, secondly, they need to think about other forms of identification and knowledge. So, for example, in Europe, you can bring forward a letter from a solicitor that will show that you were here. At the moment, they're still keeping the hard line. Never mind all the stuff we heard today. There will still be people who will effectively be stateless and jobless.
Thank you very much indeed. Thanks to all of you for coming in. Thank you.
Carol and Stig are here, and it is the Windrush story you want to start.
Yeah, and the Windrush generation, as it's became known, were the people from the Caribbean who came over to Britain in the early 1950s, requested more or less by the British government. Britain was on its knees after the Second World War. It desperately needed people to come and take up jobs. And bluntly, the government didn't really want that many Caribbean people, but they kind of agreed to have some of them. And they came over here. They'd been part of the British Empire, as was for a long time. They were British. They saw themselves as British. The Evening Standard actually splash on the day the Empire Windrush landed was called Welcome Home. That was the headline that came in. And the piece of legislation existed in 1948 that said anyone who'd been in the colonies, been in the Empire, was welcome to come and live in Britain. By 1962, there was a Commonwealth Act that restricted their ability to come over. In 1968, it was made worse by a Labour government. And effectively, people were turned from citizens to immigrants. And that really set the pattern of our immigration debate for the next centuries to come. So these people were hugely valued, hugely valid parts of this country. They weren't welcomed very nicely. And the crowning indignity now comes 30, 40, 50, 60 years on, where because of more stringent immigration restrictions, they're now being asked to produce paperwork they've never been given. And in the absence of that paperwork, they've been threatened with deportation. They may have been deported. They've been sent as far as the airport. They've been put into immigrant detention centres, effectively. They've been subjected to all sorts of indignity because the Home Office has started imposing more stringent immigration restrictions, and this is the product.
And of course, this all changed in changes to the immigration system in 2012 changed this because it clamped down on people living here who didn't have the relevant paperwork. And of course, all of these people, and we have no idea how many. I mean, it's in the hundreds of thousands of people here. Many people who came, children who came with their parents, who came on the passports of their parents and had no paperwork, and never actually thought. I mean, there's a gentleman in the paper tonight saying he never thought he needed paperwork, he never thought he needed a passport because he assumed he was British. And I think this is a story that happens to a lot of these people. They just assume they were British, and many of them, I guess, haven't left the country and they haven't needed a passport. So this is a massive shock to them. There's a story. There's a very good case study in the Mail of a woman called Sarah O'Connor, who arrived here from Jamaica in 1966. She was just 6. I mean, she's been living in this country for the past 20 years in a house in Dagenham in East London. She's been paying tax, she's been doing everything right. Suddenly, she's illegal and she has no paperwork to prove.
So and there's access to pensions and access to the health service, which is part of the problem.
And of course, Amber Rudd has faced a barrage of criticism over this.
And apologised, to be fair.
And she has apologised, to be fair. But, you know, she must have known about this. And, you know, they're now saying there's going to be a special task force set up to deal with this. And they're saying that most people will not have to wait longer than 2 weeks for paperwork, which begs the question, why wasn't it done decades ago? Because it isn't just this government who's who's cocked it up. It's previous governments that have cocked it up. This is not a story that just happened yesterday.
But that is the point, isn't it? Did the mistakes come in 2012 when the immigration rules became
But
stricter,
they never had paperwork.
or decades ago?
But they never got paper because the Home Office never kept records of the people that they gave indefinite leaves to stay. So the Home Office had no idea who was here. They had no idea what anyone was doing. They should have given them papers for indefinite leave to remain so that they had them and it made them, you know, legal.
But this is a direct consequence. Theresa May, as Home Secretary, created what she called proudly a hostile environment to disincentivise people to immigrate to this country and to claim benefits while they were here. So she deliberately and openly said, we want to make it hard for people.
But that was of late, and you know that. This isn't the same situation.
But it's the consequence of that. The reason why they are being asked for paperwork they can't provide is because the rules were changed in 2012 to create a hostile environment against immigrants. The very policy that was heralded and trumpeted and supported by the Daily Mail.
So this is cock-up, not conspiracy.
Everything in Britain is always cock-up, not conspiracy. It's a shambles. It's a continued
shambles. You're suggesting
shambles.
It's a conspiracy to keep immigrants out.
It was a conspiracy. It was a deliberate conspiracy to create a hostile environment for immigration in this country. A policy supported and demanded by the Daily Mail. The unintended consequence of that is people who've been here for 40 or 50 years, when they come into contact with the bureaucracy, people are saying, hang on a second, we want greater levels of information from you. We want greater paperwork.
Are you saying this government was wrong to want to control the numbers of immigrants coming into this country?
I'm saying this is a consequence
But I'm asking you if you think that's a wrong thing or a right thing.
I think, of course, governments are entitled
because
to
huge numbers
control
of these people in this country wanted immigration controlled. They felt it was out of control. We were having huge numbers into this country every year, between 300,000 and 500,000, and it needed to be controlled. No one is saying to stop it. It's not about that. It was about control.
We've always had the ability to control people outside of the EU.
Okay.
Of course we have.
Well,
since 1968, since 1962.
Okay, but
That's
not
decades
not,
and decades
not
and decades
from
of this
inside
control.
the EU.
Yeah, but we're not talking about that. That's exactly my point.
We're talking about
Theresa
both.
May was asked to deliberately create a hostile environment to immigrants. Why are we now surprised that immigrants have been treated badly? Because exactly this.
Because we didn't know people had no paperwork.
Yes.
We didn't know, but if you're going to create a system where you'd have high demands, there will be a whole sorts of people who come into this country over.
Listen,
it's their job to know these things. It's their job to
paperwork.
find out these things. And when they are told about these things, which didn't happen yesterday, it didn't happen 2 days ago.
They should have reacted.
They should have reacted like that. And this is a group of people who came to this country when it was on its knees and helped it get on its feet. They came here. They weren't brilliantly welcomed. It's one of the great national shames how a lot of black people were treated when they came to this country. And this is an indignity upon an indignity.
No one's arguing that. What I'm taking issue with, you're saying it's Theresa May created a hostile environment. What she is trying to do in response to the Brexit vote is to control immigration, because that's what a lot of people voted for, to have immigration control. They're not the same stories.
No, my point is, she did this in 2012, which is before Brexit.
No, but the Tories have long had a policy of having immigration in the tens of thousands, which
has never happened.
Yes.
And the point is that, and indeed, half the immigrants don't come from the EU, so Brexit's really got nothing to do with it. But I just think, I've married into a Windrush family. My wife comes from Trinidad. Her mum comes from Trinidad, and her mum came over at about this time, in common with lots of people who felt.
So your wife had paperwork because she had a passport, is that right?
She has
so this only applies to people who've not tried to leave the country.
And it goes back, and it's people who haven't moved and come in contact with the bureaucracy for 30 or 40 years, who haven't needed some of the formalities. Because as a nation, generally, we work a lot on trust. We don't want ID cards. We don't want lots of paperwork for people to have to demand who they are. For us to demand who they are, until 2012, where we started demanding more and more. And we said to companies, if you employ people, we need to know every single thing about them. So it was companies having to turn people over.
What we need to find out as well, how many people have been deported, because the Home Office doesn't actually know that.
Well, and Amber Rudd actually was more specific. She said she's not aware of anyone.
She said of no one, but earlier an immigration minister called Caroline Noakes was interviewed, and she said there'd been some horrendous situations. The reporter said to her, we'll take that as a yes then. And she's just saying, she didn't confirm it, but she didn't deny it. And I don't agree with Diana very often, but what she said was that the people who have been deported should be compensated. And yes, they should be.
If any have.
If any have.
If they haven't, they'll have lived in fear of it, or they'll have been pushed into a system.
Well, I'm not sure they would have lived in fear of it, because it's only until fairly recently when they have tried to do, when the thing changed. They haven't lived in fear for 20 or 30 years, because they didn't know they needed the paperwork. Only since 2012.
But that's months and months. And some of these people have been, The Guardian's reporting, it's a journalist called Amelia Gentleman, who has kind of been ploughing a lonely furrow on this. And no one really, like a lot of these stories, for some reason they don't catch. And then all of a sudden it has caught, and everyone's saying, well, why didn't we do something about it before?
Yeah.
And she, I imagine, would say, well, I've been writing about this for a long time.
But actually, all those Commonwealth heads of government who are coming to London, are in London, welcomed by the royal family, suddenly it seems like a good time to push the story again.
But it's interesting, but Theresa May said in the middle of last week she didn't want to meet the heads of the Commonwealth. Suddenly she's changed her mind because this has turned into a massive story. So the great thing is it's going to get sorted, it's going to get changed. There's a task force now set up to deal with this, and everything will be sorted in a fortnight, we hope.
OK, well, that was one of the big elements of the House of Commons today. Amber Rudd apologising over the Windrush scandal, as the papers have put it.